That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode of this podcast, Green Light is a Radar, a podcast that encompasses social and political issues in the Middle East. In this podcast, we are going to be looking at stories, perspectives, and aspects that are overlooked or concealed. I'm Ranin Leila, and I'm Lynn Denise, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about what's the history of Palestine, and we're going to emphasize more about the crises happening now in Gaza. We're going to start out broad in this episode, and then we're going to get into more details, including real stories, real experiences, different eras of this conflict, and more. And today in this episode, we have Suhib Othman joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
Welcome. So today we want to start to kick off this podcast with a small introduction and dive into the history of Palestine. To actually see more about what's happening now in Gaza and understand it even more.
Especially because we, as non-Palestinian citizens with no Palestinian families or ties whatsoever, understand the reality of what's happening only through what is delivered to us through the media. So initially, could you tell us about yourself?
Hi, so thanks a lot for having me again. And I would like to thank you and congratulate you for starting this podcast. And I am honored to be on the first episode of your podcast. So I am Suhib Othman, and I am a computer science student at the Wuppertal University here in Germany. And as many of my peers who have different similar Palestinian roots, our grandparents witnessed both Nakba and Nakba, and I would like to emphasize on the history of those two historical events that happened in Palestine and for the Palestinian people and for the indigenous citizens of Palestine.
Okay, so as you told us now, basically your grandparents lived the Nakba.
Yeah.
So can you emphasize more on exactly what happened, what were their experience and what they lived throughout the whole thing?
First of all, let us just justify Nakba. Nakba is an Arabic expression that is translated in English into catastrophe. It's the event that happened in 1948, where more than 750,000 Palestinians were expelled and killed and kicked off their homelands and the houses, and they were robbed their dreams and the state. The Nakba happened for all the Palestinians in whole. However, one of those families of the Palestinians were both of my parents' families from my mother's side and from my father's side. They were expelled from cities that were at the outskirts of Jerusalem and refugees in Jordan, and then became refugees in Jordan. So that's the story, and that's why I haven't seen Palestine. So my parents didn't go back to Palestine ever since Nakba.
What about the social stratification? What was the social status of your parents in Palestine?
So let me just emphasize more on my families that come from Palestine. My grandma from my father's side, she was such a strong lady with such an ambition towards life. She loved me like no grandparent loved their grandson ever. And she kept telling me stories about Palestine, and she kept telling me stories about what happened for her during the Nakba, what happened for her in the Nakba, and how her emotions were, and whom from my uncles and aunts were there with her. However, let me just emphasize on something. My grandma, Fatima, she had that dream of going back to Palestine at the deathbed in 2019. She had that dream that one day she's going to Palestine, even when she was 85 years old. And that just always astonished me, how she had that dream that she's going back, and she knew that that's her legitimate right to get her homeland back, even if she was a Jordanian citizen, and even if she lived a new life, she had a new home, and etc. They didn't replace her homeland. On emphasizing on the social status on Palestine.
Now I'm curious what your grandmother was. What was her social status like?
Okay, so both of my parents come from villages communities. Those villages communities were relying on farming and harvesting towards living. And those my grandma comes from Beit Safafa, which is a city 4 kilometers from 4 kilometers away from the old city of Jerusalem. And she come from a villager's family, so she didn't go to any school. She didn't knew how to write, read. However, she had the wisdom to knew her right, her legitimate rights, that she owns that land. And on emphasizing on the social status, let me just tell you something. Most of the Palestinians from my father's side, or from my mother's side, didn't went to school because they were villagers relying on farming. You don't need to know how to multiply and divide when you're just harvesting and counting potatoes or tomatoes. However, when they moved and when they were robbed of their lands, their homes, they knew that the only thing they had is education. So an astonishing number of educated aunts and aunts I have now. They are all well educated, and they are all they use the education and the certificates and the diplomas as what armed them for life. Because the only way that a refugee can get money from now is not from the land, it's from being a civil servant or being an employee. So an astonishing number of university educated people. Yeah.
Okay. So after talking about Nakba, can we just talk about more of what were the aftermaths of what happened after Nakba? What were the things that actually occurred after Nakba happened? Like, what were the things and the aftermaths people had to face after that?
Okay, so well in numbers, and let me give you textbook context to Nakba. Nakba happened in 1948. It gave us the following outcomes. First of all, you would never see a textbook explanation and example for ethnical cleansing such as Nakba. The majority of the people who own the land were expelled from the land, an average that can reach to sometimes to 800,000 indigenous Palestinians were refugees in East Jerusalem, West Bank, and also Gaza Strip, and also other neighboring countries such as Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. The aftermaths of Nakba, we had people who were killed, we had refugees, and we started the issue of the Palestine who started. So people were expelled from their homes and robbed on their lands. So to just give Nakba one own sentence, it's a textbook explanation of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Yeah.
I mean, could you give us a more detailed summary about the historical background of Palestine? This is all very important, but a book can only tell us so much. So could you please tell us more about the historical background in summary?
Well, of course. Let me just emphasize on the location of Palestine. Palestine is located on the Levant area at the west bank of the Jordanian River. It stretches all the way from Syria and Lebanon towards Egypt, and borders that stretch all along with Jordan. Historical Palestine was well known for the indigenous people who were majority of Muslims, Christians, and also a minority of Jews. That's before the British colonies were colonizing, the British government were colonizing Palestine. However, after the persecution of Jews in Europe, the Jews started believing that they were feeling unsafe in Europe, so they needed somewhere safe to hide from the Europeans. So they started thinking about building a state for them. Let me give you one of those stories. The Jewish home idea was proposed by an Austrian journalist who's named Theodor Herzl, who wrote a book in German. It's called the Judenstadt, which means the Jewish home, or a home for the Jews, which is the correct translation, by the way. He witnessed several trials in Europe and found out clearly that those trials were biased for Europeans and not for Jews, and that the Jews were, and the Europeans didn't agree on having the Jews such as a normalized body within the European communities. And by the way, he didn't care about the religion. He cared about the ethnicity. And so he supposed a home for Jews, not a Jewish home. After the World War I, the Zionist movement, which believed and cheered by Herzl's idea, were supported by England and the British colony, and they got the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration declared Palestine was... So back then, we need to give some historical context. Palestine was a British colony, and after it was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, it then became a British colony, and we will emphasize on that later. The British colony, which were in control of the Palestine area, declared and promised the Jewish Zionist movement the land of Palestine. The British forces were an occupation force too. So it is literally a promise from who doesn't own to this who doesn't qualify. Yeah. So the Jewish movement in Palestine, the Jewish people started moving to Palestine in vessels, which is illegal immigration, creating terror also for Palestinians, robbing their own houses and terrifying them, and expelling Palestinian families from their own homes and stealing them, which is also a textbook illegal immigrations and occupation. And they started proposing the idea that Palestine is a land with no people to people with no land. However, we knew for a fact and for historical figures that Palestine had its indigenous people. And they also used holy books as a real state evidence, and it treated God, His Almighty, as if a real state agent. And that's the issue of that's the historical background of what was happening on Palestine. We can emphasize on that later.
Yeah, sure. But what do you think was the reason why they actually have chosen Palestine? Why did they think that Palestine was actually the chosen and the promised land for Jews? Like, why was that an idea from the start?
Well, first of all, that's a hard question to be answered because, in fact, we need to give some background too. First of all, the Western world had the issue of the Jews, and they wanted to solve the issue by exporting them, so by getting rid of them. And that's painful too. And they wanted to export them to anywhere. They didn't have the land in choice. So Theodor Herzl didn't want Palestine explicitly. As I have said before, he wasn't interested in religion. He was interested in saving the ethnicity. So when Theodor Herzl proposed the idea, he proposed other lands such as Argentina, Mozambique, Al Arish, and the list goes on. They wanted to rob more lands. But the conflict of the Jews was met by another conflict, and that was the Ottoman Empire issue. They wanted to create a colonial body to destroy the Ottoman Empire. So the two conflicts started, and they insisted on creating a colonial body in the Levant area that was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And what's better than the Holy Land of Palestine, which was in a significant importance for the Ottoman Empire and the Arabs.
But Suhaib, if you happen to see the land of Palestine as the God promised land, it was promised by God, and that is opposing what you're saying, isn't it?
Okay, so I was surprised you with something, which is in many Jewish scholars were considering that their return to the Holy Land, which they supposed Palestine to be, was a sin by many Jewish scholars. And it is called in Hebrew, ضحكت هكات, which means the hastening of the end of the Jewish people. And because they saw that they need to go back to the Holy Land when the Messiah or the Al-Mashiach comes back to earth to lead them back to the Holy Land. And that's why the first conference of the Zionist movement was planned to be in Munich, Germany, but many of the Jewish groups were opposing to that. And till today, we have a Jewish group called Naturi Karta, and they are still against the idea of choosing Palestine as a home for the Jewish people because it calls the ضحكت هكات, and it hastens the end of the whole religion.
These are actually great information that maybe everyone actually knows. But do you really think that most people are familiar with the conflict going on in Palestine and what's happening over there now, or like in these 75 years and everything that's been happening since then?
Well, after what's happening in the last month, I guess now the Palestinian conflict is back on the spotlight. And it's back on the spotlight as it is a right between, as it is a conflict between, it's a conflict between the struggle for liberation and freedom, and it should always be presented as that. It was always before presented as if it is the conflict between this warring conflict that's happening in Arabia between those two Abrahamic nations fighting and using religion, blah, blah, blah. But now we can see that from the Western world, I'm living in Germany, and I can see from my peers in the university that they are now well in knowledge that the Palestinians were robbed of their homes. They were robbed of the dreams, and they were robbed of their city and state. Yeah.
An interesting expression we've been hearing so much recently, Gaza is being referred to as the largest open-air prison in the whole world. Why is that?
Well, let me call back something. After a Nakba, many people moved to refugee camps. One of that camp was East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and neighboring countries, and etc., and West Bank. So Gaza was one of that. So Gaza is technically a refugee camp, and also it has indigenous Palestinians who lived there ever since the armies were there. However, Gaza is the fifth most densely population on Earth, if you consider Gaza alone to be a country. Gaza has more 2.2 million people living in that strip. And also, they can't leave Gaza through only one space. They can only leave Gaza through only one space, which is the Rafah border. It's a cross border between Palestine and also Egypt. And it's usually controlled by the Israeli government or the Israeli authorities. And also, another thing to emphasize on, which not a lot of people knew about, it's that the fissures of Gaza cannot go further than 300 meters on offshores, so they can't go to a longer place from the shores of Gaza. They can only go into sea by 300 meters, and they need to be back. That's why they found out that Gaza is an open present. However, let me also add that Gaza is also surrounded by a wall, of course. Israel loves walls. So it always builds walls, and there's walls, I have said, that's walls. They build a wall separating West Bank from the area that was robbed in 1948. They built walls in East Jerusalem and Jerusalem itself. They loved the idea of walls. Yeah.
Now, after you gave us an understanding of what actually happened and why is it called like the largest open air prison, I would ask this question. Do you think what's happening currently in Gaza is another ethnic cleansing, the same as a Nakba that happened in 1948? Is it actually repeating itself? Is history repeating itself? It's happening again. Is this actually like the same thing happening over again? Is that part two of it?
Well, of course, it's history repeating itself again. So at first, at 1948, no one stopped the occupational forces of Israel to do what it has done. So it repeated itself. If he didn't stop something that was going on and destroying something, he will keep on destroying other stuff. So it's history repeating itself. Let's make that also clear and loud to the people. What is happening now in Palestine didn't start 1 month ago. It started 75 years ago.
Yeah. This point very clear. Thank you for making this very loud. However, what's currently happening in Gaza after the Israeli attacks, which started on the 7th of October, it has been reported that there were more than 10K deaths. There were over 24K people injured. Almost 2,000 people are still missing under the rubble, and 1.5 million civilians were displaced. Do you think that these facts are being acknowledged enough?
100%. I guess that it's now loud out and clear that the media channels are biased, and the media channels are giving out misleading and misinformation. So misleading information and misinformation regarding the conflict. I guess you're the media experts. You can elaborate on this.
Yes, I think we've been seeing a lot of things happening now with the algorithms of social media, Instagram platforms, and so many other things happening now. It's so biased with the content it's being like posted there. The content allowed to actually being shared to people for them to see. So I think we've been seeing this a lot happening currently with the posts that are being shared, with the reels, with the sensitive content that are not being allowed to actually be spread and for people to actually see this and acknowledge it. They're labeling these videos as sensitive content, which they suggest people not to watch. And they either make the stories unavailable, they shadow ban people who are trying to share these images, and some people even got their accounts deleted. The most famous Instagram account reporting about Palestine was recently taken down for its recent posts, but thankfully they got after people started. So exactly, but I think if we want to talk more about propaganda and what the Israeli forces have been trying to actually pay for the market and the propaganda they're trying to market, I think it's been falling apart.
Exactly.
Since everything has been happening now, I think people are being able to actually see the real size, the real actually faces of what's happening now, and who's actually the victim and who's trying to occupy Palestine and what it was before and what's happening right now. So I think it did bring some understanding to the people now, and they did understand exactly what's the history, the background, and what's happening now. And I think it's really did help people understand more.
Well, so as a Palestinian, what is one thing you wish the public knew about Palestine? What is something they don't already know, but to you is very important and you wish they had already known it?
So, first of all, other than that, hummus is Palestinian. So we can debate between Arabs whether hummus is Syrian or is it Egyptian, but we can't debate whether hummus is Israeli or it is Palestinian. Well, they also brought the culture. Hummus is Palestinian, za'atar is Palestinian, and our beautiful embroideries are Palestinian. So that's a fact. Other than that, people need to know that we, as Palestinians, we need peace and freedom for our people. And that's the thing that I wish that all of the people knew. I had that amazing conversation yesterday while I was buying my groceries between me and one of my neighbors. He started asking me whether I'm going to the one of the protests that's happening in my city, Wuppertal. He started asking me whether I'm going or not, and he was also going. He's 100% white. He's German, and he started getting educated about the idea of that there's a conflict that's happening in the Middle East, and that's not a boring Abrahamic conflict between those two religions. It's not a thing that's happening between Muslims and Jewish people. It's something that's happening between right and wrong. It's something that's happening between people who want liberation and freedom. That's what I wish the people knew. And now it's finally happening. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a really astonishing thing, seeing people actually being educated about this matter again, understanding its background, conflicts, and everything.
They're realizing it's interesting that people are realizing that this is a humanitarian issue and not just their religious conflict or so.
That's definitely something. We would first like to thank you so much for everything that you gave us, and we would want to ask you if there's anything else you would like to add.
Well, I would like to thank you for having me, and I am one of the least qualified people of Palestine to speak about the Palestinian conflict. In fact, my parents never seen Palestine. My grandma passed and my grandparents passed this to their own son and their own daughter, and she and him, my father and my mother, passed this on to me. And I will keep passing this to also my incoming, from my ancestors to my son, as it is really our right to go back to our homeland. I wish that one day I will say to one of my friends here in Germany that next month I'm going back to my home country. I have never said that because, well, I was robbed off my home country. No.
That was actually really great. I would like to ask you one last question, if we can talk about that. What about the journalists in Gaza now? What about some of the journalists that are actually educating us more about the matter, and they're publishing pictures that make us actually see the reality of what's happening?
Journalists, I think it's really important for us to know.
That's one of the most astonishing things that's happened in the last century. Well, the Western media started, as always, fabricating facts, beheaded babies, and so on, and Biden himself. However, the people transferred their mobile phones into TV channels. So a Palestinian such as Mu'taz Azaizeh was more powerful during this war, this genocide, than CNN. So powerful, yeah.
We even got to know more about him in this conflict. And the way we felt like we were in the scene. We actually were able to actually see and acknowledge everything that was going around. And that's like another feeling of letting us actually know and feel like we belong to the case and the conflict. Again, So we'd like to thank you again so much for joining us today. We actually learned so much from you. We educated ourselves about so many matters. I would just only want to ask you one last question, if you would like to add anything.
Yes, please. So, what you're doing now, you, Lean, and Reem, and many other people who are using their platforms to educate people on this matter is really amazing. Please go to this following website. That's going to be in the description. It's the Palestine Academy, thepalestineacademy.com. It emphasizes on everything that happened to the Palestinian people, starting from the Nakba, moving to, till today, which is the Gaza emergency. And we only want freedom and peace. And that's all that I can add. I would thank you a lot.
That is definitely true. Do not forget to check out the links that we will attach.
And we actually did use it to do some research for this episode, and it was so beneficial. So we would literally recommend it for you guys.
Well, the people that started this Palestine, I'm not well in knowledge of who are the founders of the Palestine Academy, but thank them. I'm just moving around and telling people from Germany and from other international communities to just go and check the Palestine Academy. It can educate you more. And there's one of those courses. It's Palestine 101. It gives a lot of historical context and videos towards what happened in Palestine. Yeah.
And it was a great thing to actually help. Yes, it really was. So Suhib, we'd like to give you a massive thank you once again for joining us. And thank you so much to everybody who stuck with us until the end of this episode and educated themselves. We hope you benefited and enjoyed it as much as we did. And for like one last thing, we would like to say, stay tuned for our next episode that is coming really soon. And thank you so much for watching.
Thank you so much for having me.
يا حب موت